And for more on the protests and the political crisis in Ukraine, Professor Stephen Fish joins me now from San Francisco. He's a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Fish, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Susan.
Do you think President Viktor Yanukovych expected this large of a pushback from the opposition?
I think he was expecting pushback from the opposition. The laws that he has recently pushed through are really tough. They're really draconian laws that actually limit freedoms of speech and assembly. I think he was expecting some pushback.
Well, the U.S. Secretary of State, as we heard in Melanie Wilk's report, John Kerry, has said that this anti-demonstration law actually violates the EU laws. Will the EU put pressure on President Yanukovych at this point?
Well, the EU has been putting pressure on him, and the United States has as well, because a lot of the measures he's been taking, and not just with this recent law on protests, but things he's been doing really, frankly, ever since he came to office a few years ago, have been quite undemocratic. So he's been getting an earful from the EU and from the United States government for years. It doesn't seem to have much effect on him so far, though. He seems to be more concerned with his relations with President Putin in Russia. And of course, the Russian government is not putting any pressure on him to act democratically, quite the contrary.
Is there any way to gauge how much of this demonstration is about the anti-demonstration law and how much of it is about President Yanukovych and his siding with Russian policies as opposed to the EU?
That's a good question. You know, it's very hard to separate those things out. I think in most Ukrainians' minds, they really come together. I think at first the demonstrations were about the economic pact with Russia, the fact that the Ukrainian government had decided to choose closer relations with Russia rather than closer relations with Europe in economic terms. But after that, with subsequent events, the crackdown in the protests, the violence against the journalists that happened a few weeks ago, I think the protests have turned more general. They're more generally about democracy and human rights and anti-corruption causes. For President Yanukovych to recently pass this law that limits freedoms of assembly and freedoms of speech only fuels that fire. It only makes more Ukrainians feel like they're fighting not just for closer relations with Europe, but for democracy and self-governance in their own country.
Even opposition leader Vitaly Klitschko has asked this crowd to simmer down, if you will. Is this crowd too fired up to actually turn back at this point?
I think they can turn back at this point. I think one problem that we're seeing, though, with this crowd is that the opposition is not unified in Ukraine. They're not unified in terms of tactics, to be sure. Most of the demonstrators are committed to peaceful demonstration. They've shown that in recent months. They showed that going all the way back to 2004, 2005, during the Orange Revolution, which was very peaceful. But what we see now is some demonstrators getting very frustrated and clashing with police. And as you note, the leaders of the demonstrations are actually discouraging this kind of behavior. They're saying this is irresponsible. But this is, to some extent, is to be expected because the opposition is not entirely unified.
Professor Stephen Fish, live in California, thank you for your insight and your time.
My pleasure.